The silence stretched for 12 seconds before Chris Evans realized the teenage boy in the fifth row was holding his breath. Ellen had been discussing toxic masculinity and emotional vulnerability with the Captain America actor when she noticed the young man's father elbowing him, whispering harshly about something that was making the teenager's face turn red with shame. What happened next proved that sometimes the most heroic thing a man can do is show another man that it's okay to feel. The Ellen DeGeneres Show studio buzzed with thoughtful energy this Wednesday afternoon in Burbank. 360 audience members filled the iconic space, many of them drawn by the rare opportunity to hear one of Hollywood's most respected leading men discuss his evolution from shy kid to confident actor, and more importantly, his journey toward understanding healthy masculinity. Chris Evans sat in the guest chair with relaxed confidence, wearing a perfectly fitted charcoal gray sweater that somehow managed to look both casual and sophisticated. Ellen, radiant in a burgundy blazer with subtle silver threading that caught the studio lights, was deeply engaged as Chris spoke with surprising candor about his struggles with anxiety and the pressure to always appear strong and in control. "Chris, you've been incredibly open about your anxiety and panic attacks," Ellen said, her voice carrying the gentle respect that had made difficult conversations feel safe for millions of viewers. "What made you decide to talk publicly about something that so many men, especially in Hollywood, keep hidden?" Chris leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely in his lap as he considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Ellen, I think I got tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't. For years, I thought that being a man meant never showing weakness, never admitting when you're scared or overwhelmed. I thought vulnerability was the enemy of masculinity." The audience listened with unusual intensity, many of the men nodding in recognition, while partners and family members leaned forward, grateful to hear these words spoken aloud by someone their loved ones respected and admired. "But what I learned," Chris continued, "is that real strength isn't about hiding your struggles. It's about being brave enough to acknowledge them, to ask for help when you need it, and to model for other men and boys that it's okay to be human first and manly second." But Ellen's attention was gradually being drawn to the fifth row, where a teenage boy, probably 15 or 16, sat next to a middle-aged man who appeared to be his father. The boy's eyes were red and slightly puffy, suggesting he'd been crying recently, and Ellen could see the man whispering urgently to him with what looked like frustration or embarrassment. As Chris spoke about the importance of emotional authenticity, Ellen noticed the teenager's breathing becoming more labored, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The father continued his whispered admonishments, and Ellen could see enough of his body language to understand that he was telling his son to toughen up or stop being emotional in exactly the kind of moment Chris was describing as harmful. "You know, Chris," Ellen said, though she found herself increasingly focused on the distressed teenager, "what you're describing sounds like exactly the kind of conversation that young men need to hear, especially from their fathers. Do you think men your age have a responsibility to model this kind of emotional honesty for the next generation?" Chris's expression grew more serious, his voice taking on the passionate tone that appeared whenever he discussed issues he cared deeply about. "Absolutely, Ellen. I think we have to be the generation that breaks the cycle. Too many boys grow up thinking that crying is weak, that asking for help is shameful, that showing emotion makes them less of a man. And then they become men who can't connect with their own children, their partners, even themselves." As Chris spoke about breaking cycles of emotional suppression, Ellen watched the teenager's distress increase. The young man was clearly fighting tears, his father's whispered criticism making everything worse. Ellen recognized the signs of a young person caught between natural emotional expression and learned shame about those very emotions. Ellen stood up abruptly from her chair, her burgundy blazer creating a striking silhouette as she raised one hand toward Chris to indicate she needed to pause the conversation. The unexpected movement caused a ripple of confusion through the studio as audience members tried to understand what was happening. "Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt," Ellen said, her voice carrying across the studio with unusual gravity. "But I think we have a real-time example of exactly what you're talking about happening right here in our audience." Chris immediately turned to look where Ellen was gesturing, his expression shifting to protective concern the moment he saw the crying teenager and the obviously frustrated father. Ellen walked down the steps toward the audience, but instead of her usual confident stride, she moved with the careful determination of someone stepping into a situation that required delicate handling. The cameras followed her, understanding that something unscripted and important was unfolding. "Excuse me," Ellen said gently as she approached the fifth row, addressing both the father and son with equal respect. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem upset. Is everything okay?" The father looked mortified to be called out publicly, while the teenager stared at Ellen with eyes full of shame and relief in equal measure. 16-year-old Marcus Thompson from Portland had been holding back tears for the entire interview, moved by Chris's words about emotional authenticity, but terrified of his father's disapproval. "I'm sorry," the father, David Thompson, said stiffly. "My son is just being overly emotional. Boys his age need to learn when it's appropriate to show feelings, and when it's time to be strong." Ellen felt her heart break a little as she heard exactly the kind of harmful messaging that Chris had been describing. But rather than challenging the father directly, she turned to Marcus with infinite gentleness. "Marcus," she said, having noticed his name on his school sweatshirt, "is it okay if I ask what's making you emotional today? Sometimes when something touches our hearts, it's because it's important." Marcus looked desperately between Ellen and his father, clearly torn between honesty and the learned behavior of suppressing his feelings to avoid criticism. "It's just, when he was talking about anxiety and asking for help, it made me think about my friend Jake, who—" Marcus's voice broke completely as the words caught in his throat. Chris had quietly left his chair and was now standing behind Ellen, his expression grave as he realized they were witnessing exactly the kind of father-son dynamic that perpetuated harmful ideas about masculinity. "Take your time," Ellen said softly, sitting down in the aisle so she was at Marcus's eye level. "Whatever you're feeling is valid." Marcus took a shaky breath and looked directly at Chris Evans, drawing strength from seeing his hero's encouraging nod. "My best friend Jake killed himself 2 months ago. He'd been struggling with depression and anxiety, but he never told anyone because his dad always said that depression was just an excuse for being lazy, that real men don't need therapy." The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Ellen felt tears spring to her eyes immediately, while Chris's expression transformed with recognition and deep sadness. "Jake tried to talk to me about it a few times," Marcus continued, his words coming out in a rush now that the dam had broken. "But I didn't know what to say because I'd learned the same things. That boys don't talk about feelings, that we're supposed to just push through everything, that asking for help makes you weak." David Thompson's face had gone pale as he began to understand the real-world consequences of the messages he'd been giving his son. This wasn't about teenage drama or being overly sensitive. This was about life and death. Chris knelt down beside Ellen, abandoning any concern for his expensive clothes or celebrity image. "Marcus," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so incredibly sorry about your friend Jake. And I want you to know something. Everything you're feeling right now, the sadness, the guilt, the confusion, all of it is exactly what someone who loved their friend would feel." Marcus stared at Chris through his tears, amazed to see this symbol of masculine strength speaking to him with such tenderness and understanding. "Can I tell you something?" Chris continued, his voice steady but warm. I've lost friends to suicide too, and for years I carried guilt about whether I could have said something, done something, been more present. That guilt is normal, but Marcus, it's not your fault. You were a kid dealing with something that even adults struggle to handle. Ellen watched this extraordinary exchange, understanding that they were witnessing something that could literally save lives. A public conversation about male mental health happening between a teenage boy and a man he respected. But here's what I learned, Chris said, his hands clasped in front of him in an open, non-threatening posture. The best way to honor Jake's memory isn't to shut down your emotions or pretend this didn't affect you. It's to be the kind of friend and eventually the kind of man who creates safe spaces for other people to share their struggles. Marcus nodded through his tears, clearly recognizing something in Chris's words that felt like permission to grieve, to feel, to be human without apology. David Thompson had been silent during this exchange, but Ellen could see his expression changing as he processed what his son had just revealed and what Chris was modeling in response. "Mr. Thompson," Ellen said gently, turning to address the father, "I can see this is hard for you too. Sometimes as parents, we pass on messages we received without questioning whether they're helpful." David's voice was rough with emotion when he finally spoke. I didn't know about Jake. Marcus, why didn't you tell me?" Marcus looked at his father with eyes that held years of learned silence. "Because every time I tried to talk about anything emotional, you told me to toughen up. I didn't think you'd want to hear about depression and suicide and how scared I was." The raw honesty in Marcus's words created a moment of reckoning that everyone in the studio could feel. This was a father and son confronting patterns that had been building for years. Chris leaned forward, addressing David directly, but with respect rather than judgment. "Sir, I can see that you love your son and want him to be strong. But what if I told you that teaching him it's okay to feel deeply, to ask for help, to be vulnerable with people he trusts? What if that's actually the strongest thing you could teach him?" David looked between his son, who was still crying but seemed somehow lighter after being heard, and Chris Evans, whose obvious strength and confidence weren't diminished by his emotional openness. "I learned from my father that men don't cry," David said quietly. "That you handle your problems alone, that showing weakness invites attack. I thought I was protecting him." Ellen felt her heart go out to this father, who was realizing that the protection he thought he was providing had actually isolated his son during the most difficult period of his young life. "But look at your son right now," Chris said gently. "He just shared the hardest thing he's ever experienced, and he's still here, still strong, still your boy. The difference is now he knows he doesn't have to carry that pain alone." David Thompson looked at his son, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Without saying a word, he reached over and pulled Marcus into a hug that was fierce, protective, and full of apology. "I'm sorry," David whispered, loud enough for the microphones to catch. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you couldn't talk to me. I'm sorry about Jake, and I'm sorry I thought protecting you meant teaching you not to feel." Ellen stood up and placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "This is exactly what healing looks like. This is how we break cycles and build better relationships with the men in our lives." Chris nodded emphatically, his own eyes wet with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "Marcus, you just did something incredibly brave. You told the truth about your pain, and look what happened. It opened up a conversation that could change your relationship with your dad forever." The studio audience erupted in applause, not the polite television kind, but the deep, sustained recognition of witnessing something authentic and transformative. Many of the men in the audience were wiping away their own tears, while women squeezed the hands of their partners and sons. Ellen turned to address the camera directly, her burgundy blazer and silver accents creating a striking image as she spoke to millions of viewers. This is why conversations like this matter. This is why we need men like Chris to model emotional courage, and why we need to create spaces where young men like Marcus can be honest about their struggles without shame. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson had started a mental health awareness club at his Portland high school, creating the kind of safe space for emotional expression that could have saved his friend Jake. His father David had begun attending therapy to examine his own relationship with masculinity and emotion, modeling for his son that growth and change were possible at any age. Chris Evans partnered with several suicide prevention organizations to create a campaign specifically aimed at teenage boys, using his platform to normalize conversations about mental health and emotional expression. The campaign featured real stories from young men who had found strength through vulnerability rather than spite it. Ellen's show began featuring regular segments about healthy masculinity and emotional literacy, creating a national conversation about how to raise boys who could be both strong and emotionally intelligent, both confident and capable of asking for help when they needed it. Marcus kept a photo of Jake in his bedroom, but instead of being a reminder of guilt and loss, it became a symbol of his commitment to being the kind of friend who could hold space for difficult emotions, who could speak openly about mental health, who understood that true strength included the courage to feel deeply and love freely. Because sometimes the most important conversations happen when we stop pretending to be invulnerable and start showing each other what authentic strength actually looks like. Not the absence of emotion, but the courage to feel it fully and share it honestly with the people who matter most.